Wes. I'm not on video right now, but I want to welcome you all to this panel, and I would love to hand the floor over to Judge Corriero.
Thank you, Wes. Good evening. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In those few words, Martin Luther King sparked a powerful declaration of faith. And it is in that spirit of faith that I welcome you to our panel this evening. COVID-19 pandemic, an opportunity to reimagine rehabilitation for juvenile offenders. My name is Michael Corriero, and I've been asked by Avenues for Justice, one of the city's most respected alternative to incarceration programs, to moderate this virtual panel on the impact of the pandemic on court-involved youth. Since the outbreak of the virus, much attention has been focused on youth in congregate care. The virus presents painful challenges for New York City youth, particularly low-income youth of color, and their families caught up in the juvenile and criminal justice systems. The decision by a court as to how to treat an adolescent offender, an already complex one, is now even more complicated by the fear that a young person's exposure to the virus will be heightened by detention and confinement. The goal of this panel, its objective, is to highlight effective responses to this dilemma by the courts and alternative to incarceration programs. We hope that this forum will result in a consensus on an effective policy that reflects a humane and thoughtful approach to a just outcome for youth encountering the courts in the future and at this time of challenge. A challenge that has been magnified by the tragic death of George Floyd. Mr. Floyd's death has illuminated the urgency of enlightened responses to the dual challenges that we face to public safety and the true administration of justice. Together, these crises have touched the soul of this nation. In setting the stage for this panel, we want to encourage the panelists to focus on policies together. Let this be a collaborative effort, if you will. We want to identify policies that can remain in place after the end of the pandemic, and we want to demonstrate how government agencies and nonprofits can work together to maximize reliance on youth programs. It is my personal wish that the discussion this evening will move us forward and closer to our destination on that proverbial arc of justice. Before introducing our distinguished panel, let me explain our format in this era of virtual presentations. Each panelist will be given 5 minutes to discuss their institution's or agency's response to the virus. Then each panelist will be given an opportunity to ask a question of another panelist, who will have 5 minutes to respond. The remaining time will be devoted to addressing questions previously submitted by you. The panelists have received copies of your questions in advance, and we anticipate that many of your questions will be covered by their direct presentations. The remainder of our time will be used to address unanswered questions, as many as time permits, and then followed by a brief summation by me. So I am very honored to be a part of this panel, to moderate the panel, and to be with this evening some extremely influential and knowledgeable panelists who I think will make a contribution that we will all appreciate as we go forward. Tonight we are joined by Elizabeth Glazer. Elizabeth? Ms. Glazer is the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. She is the senior criminal justice policy advisor to the mayor and oversees citywide criminal justice policy. Judge Edwina Mendelson, Judge Mendelson is the Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for Justice Initiatives for the New York State Court System. Her role is to ensure meaningful access to justice for all New Yorkers. Meg Reiss. Ms. Reiss is a prosecutor and chief of social justice in the Kings County District Attorney's Office. Her primary objective in this role is to minimize the use of convictions and make jail and prison the exception rather than the default. Nancy Ginsburg. Nancy? Ms. Ginsburg is the director of the Adolescent Intervention and Diversion Project of the Legal Aid Society. She is a zealous advocate for children's rights. Lucy Lang. Ms. Lang is the director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution and Community at John Jay College, a think tank that for prosecutors and communities across the country. And she previously served as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan. And tomorrow she will be moderating her own panel, June 19th, Prosecution and Racial Justice in America at 11 a.m. Gamal Willis. Mr. Willis is the manager of court advocacy and outreach for Avenues for Justice. He has managed AFJ's response to the COVID-19 epidemic, impacting 300 youthful offenders under quarantine. We're going to begin our discussion tonight with Nancy Ginsburg. Ms. Ginsburg will give you an overview of the interrelationship between the juvenile courts, the family court, and the criminal court, the adult court. Nancy?
Thank you, Judge. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to just speak briefly about I'm going to provide an overview of the system, and then I'll talk just very briefly about legal aid's response to the epidemic. The landscape after Raise the Age has almost all kids under the age of 18 sent to the juvenile system in New York. This has created a huge change in two ways. Far fewer 16 and 17-year-olds are arrested at all. And of those who are arrested, most go to the juvenile system now. Prior to October 2018, all 16 and 17-year-olds, regardless of the level of crime charged, were prosecuted in the adult court system, facing adult consequences. Now, all 16-year-olds charged with misdemeanors go to family court, where there is an opportunity for probation adjustment or diversion prior to a decision about whether a prosecution will be pursued. 16 and 17-year-olds charged with felonies begin in criminal court in the designated youth parts, but most charges are eligible for removal to family court. In the first year of Raise the Age in New York City, 93% of nonviolent felonies were removed to family court, and 78% of violent felonies were removed. 86% of those removals occurred within 7 days of arraignment on the charges. And so one of the goals of Raise the Age was to move young people out of the criminal court system as quickly as possible. And in New York City, for the most part, that goal has been reached. As these changes have been taking place, we have not seen crime increase, which hopefully will lead to a reconsideration of how the criminal court system approaches all young people, extending age-appropriate responses to young adults whose brains are still developing. This emerging adult model is building steam, and hopefully we will soon see wider system modifications to move towards system responses that recognize young people's tremendous capacity for rehabilitation, and away from a system that saddles our young adults, particularly in communities of color, with lifelong disabilities stemming from the civil consequences of criminal convictions. As far as, I'm just gonna go over a little bit about detention and where young people go, because I think that there's some confusion about that. When young people are held in family court, they can, if they are held, and there is a presumption of release, for the most part, in the family courts at this point. They can be held in non-secure facilities, which are like group homes, or they can be held in secure detention, although very few young people in family court right now are held in secure detention. For the young people, for the youth who are prosecuted in the adult system, if bail is set or if they are remanded, they are held in secure detention in New York City. As of June 2nd, once sentenced, all young people through the age of 17 will be sentenced to juvenile facilities upstate. So there will be no young people under the age of 18 who will be in adult jails or prisons in New York. So that is a big change that we were happy to see. COVID brought many challenges to the defense bar. There were many challenges to ensure that individuals who had underlying health problems, who were specifically receptive or had health disabilities, there was a lot of work to try to get those individuals out of detention and jail. There was movement both in the detention facilities and on Rikers to do that analysis. There was a lot of work to make sure, because of COVID, visitation, personal visitation had to stop, and young people could not have personal visits with their families. So there was a lot of work with the detention facilities to ensure that kids could have as much phone and video access to their families as they could during this time of crisis. That virtual school was put into place in the detention facilities. So to the extent possible, their educations would not be interrupted as much as possible. There was an effort to ensure that programming continued, although there was a brief time where that was a little bit challenging. There are now programs that are reaching the kids who are detained. And hopefully that will be expanded as time goes on. We are certainly looking to make sure that the kids who are in detention are getting all of their services. Their mental health care has continued throughout this period, and they have continued to receive medical care as necessary. We are happy that we have seen very few kids actually test positive, and very few of them have exhibited symptoms, and we are hopeful that that continues in the future. Would you like me to?
Well, to what, keep talking?
No. I know you don't want me to do that.
I just want to hold you within the boundaries
Okay.
of our 5 minutes, but you'll have another opportunity to
Yep.
speak. Yeah, I'm curious about the numbers, the number of kids that we're talking about. And perhaps Liz Glazer can bring us up to date on that. Liz, we don't hear you.
Can you?
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Liz, did you hear me? Nancy finished, and I was curious about the numbers of young people that we're talking about now and where they're housed within the Administration for Children's Services, at least those under 18 years of age. We've lost you again. It says unmute.
Okay.
Oh, yes, yes.
I'm technically so.
Don't touch anything again, Liz.
Okay, I'm touching nothing. So there are two facilities that children are detained in New York City. One is in Brooklyn called Crossroads, and the other is in the Bronx called Horizon. And between those two facilities, there are now a little under 80 people there.
Under 80.
Under 80. So really, a pretty far cry from where we were, 6 years ago, at the start of the administration when it was a little under 300, about 275 or so. So big reduction.
And the city's response to the COVID-19 virus?
Multiple. And obviously, this is a system maybe overstates it, but there are many, many different players involved. You can see all the people on the screen here and many, many others as well. And I think, so I'd be happy. Judge, do you want me to talk about particularly that response, or?
As it applied to court involved youth, yes.
Sure. So, I think what I would say is, may I step back for a minute and just sort of put it a bit in context, if I could? So I think the thing that I think is sort of so important and hopeful about this moment is, we see how COVID in like a second distilled incredibly important issues, certainly terrible issues like these basic inequalities that run through the entire system. But it also presented us very sharply with this issue with like great urgency of whether we've reached the limits of enforcement. And Nancy sort of touched on this a little bit, and I think the judge will, and I think Judge Mendelson, we have multiple judges, and I think Meg will, about sort of very much the shrinking of the system in a minute because of COVID. And I guess what I would sort of say, and the thing that I think this panel will illuminate, so I think in a really important way, is how juvenile justice reform has always kind of led the way in criminal justice reform. And juvenile justice always kind of throws the ball out in front. And maybe it's that the public fears children less. Maybe it's because of what Nancy referred to. People understand now that the brain science is incredibly different. And obviously, there's been tremendous advocacy for those reforms. But what happened in the juvenile justice system in New York City over the last 10 years sort of suddenly got distilled and in sort of the COVID period, which is a real focus, and I sort of focus on detention because I think it holds up a mirror to how the rest of the system works. When people go in, it indicates how much police are using arrest, how much judges are using detention. And we saw this sort of massive reduction in the number of people coming into the system. And I think at the same time that happened, we also sort of saw kind of the mask pulled back on this incredible disparity that we see, which is that almost every child in the system is African American or Latino or a person of color. And those, from the city's point of view, it sort of focused on how do we actually reduce the population inside. And I think it sort of made very sharp for judges, for prosecutors, for defenders, what is the stake when you hold somebody in jail? And for me, sort of what the lessons are and what the possibilities are is that once you know, as we've seen the system shrink, and we've seen this in the adult system as well, does that actually lay the pathways for maintaining that lightness of touch? We've seen a big reduction in who it is police arrest and for what kinds of offenses. New York City has led the way as far as alternatives to incarceration. But does this moment sort of capture for us the opportunity to turn away from what has really been a police-first approach to how we maintain safety to a community-first approach of how we maintain safety? Are there ways to live peaceably together that do not rely first on the criminal justice system as really sort of the primary enforcer of how we create community safety? And that's what I think sort of the great opportunity is here. We've seen this enormous shrinking, as Nancy pointed out. We have not seen an uptick on the other side with crime. And we should take some lessons from that to try and build out, to the extent we use the criminal justice system, how we do that with the lightest touch possible.
Just a quick question. Are there many, what is the number of young people in detention that have the COVID-19 virus? Do we know that?
I don't have that number. Nancy, do you?
My understanding is, I think as of mid-May, there were about 7 young people in Horizon Juvenile Detention Center that had the COVID, and that the remainder were in Crossroads, and they seem to be free of the virus. I'm not entirely sure.
7 would be the total number.
Excuse me?
Over the entire period. I think 7 might be the total number over the entire period. But I'm not 100% sure.
Thank you, Liz. Judge Mendelson. We don't hear you, Judge.
Many people wish they had a mute button for me, right? I control my mute button. Good evening, everyone. It's a true delight and honor to be with you this evening. Judge Corriero, you have been my top secret mentor, and what was top secret about it is that you didn't know it. I've been watching you from afar and learning from you. And everyone who is serving on this panel, I admire each and every one of you for all of the great work you do. So this is a privilege. I come, and before I even go into the work part, I always start presentations like this talking about who I am and what I bring to what I'm going to be talking to you about. I'm going to be talking to you about what the court system role is in all of this, but who am I in the court system? I'm a mother, daughter, aunt, guardian, a really, really cool friend. I'm a grandmother, and my lawyering, when I was a lawyer, was in the family court system. That's when I first met Nancy, when she was representing children in family court, and I represented mostly parents in family court before becoming a judge. And I say that as a person, you set the tone, Judge Corriero, about this season, not only the losses and suffering and pain of COVID, but layering the fact that we are witnessing again and again, and really witnessing on devices and screens, killings of Black men and women, and quite frankly, questions and outrage about whether or not there is justice in our systems that address these matters. So that's the context that we're coming to you to talk about the young people who remain in our justice system in this COVID season, knowing and recognizing that COVID does not impact, it impacts us all, it does not all impact us all equally. The communities where our children and families we serve in our courts, those communities are suffering at a greater extent. And if the economic crisis that we expect to come with our budget does come, it's going to impact this community just horribly. And we are sharing fears of a loss of services just when we need them most. So I say that in terms of the context, and I say that as, you know, I talk about being a mother, but I'm from the Bronx, and I raised many children who look like, could be, and are the children that we're talking about today. So I take my role in our system quite seriously and personally, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work with you all as we try to make our piece of the world better. The courts, overnight, went from a busy, in-person, crowded operation of doing business to having to utilize technology that was not intended to be used as courtroom space, and transform that technology into brand new virtual courtrooms. We did that almost overnight, and I'm actually grateful that we never stopped prioritizing how we handled young people and adults who were arrested. Those cases, those matters were always treated as essential matters in our courts. Operating, didn't close for not even a day, operating 7 days a week, nights, weekends, to address new arrests. And Nancy, you did a marvelous job. I want your notes for the next time I have to present on Raise the Age and the changes in our system, because you explained it so clearly. It's a system of 2 different courts involving all of the children under age 18, but a family justice system that is now, because of community advocacy, has reframed our system where almost all young people under age 18 are ultimately having their cases addressed in the youth justice system in our family courts. So what I would offer from the court's point of view, we have much fewer, first of all, we've had more than a decade of effort to reduce all of our system points in juvenile justice. This didn't happen overnight. There was a deliberate focus to reach this amazing point, to those of us who have been doing this work for so long, where we have significantly reduced arrests, significantly lower rates of confinement, and significantly lower rates of young people being incarcerated. So while even in this system, and then we had this crisis where the courts did something different, particularly in family court, and this is the thing that I would offer that we should consider maintaining when we go beyond COVID. We made, and this happened all over the state, quite frankly, and the court was heavily involved in this, an actual assessment of all of the children in the state who were confined, and taking a look at those young people and making an independent, brand new determination: is incarceration, is confinement required and necessary for this young person? So that's not something that we should let go of. When we get beyond this, and we are all praying that we quickly get beyond this, the idea of not just at the arraignment, but at all system points, every time we have contact with our young people, making that determination: is there something in the community that we can be engaging in, as opposed to confinement and incarceration?
Judge Mendelson, just a point of clarification. Are you saying that, for example, the 80 young people that are now in detention, there's already been an independent assessment by a judge about their bail conditions and why the choice was to detain them as opposed to release them to a program?
I cannot confirm that every single one of those cases have been looked at. I'd be surprised if they weren't, because what has happened is, for instance, I'll take a look at New York City Family Court, which has truly very few children are confined from the family court system. Corporation Counsel, the presentment agency, did an independent review of every single child on their docket who was confined and made recommendations. I don't know the exact number. I believe it may have been 30 or more young people that they said these young people don't need to be incarcerated, discussed it with the defense bar, brought those matters to a judge. The judge, of course, the judge has the ultimate say, issued orders of release for the children. The other point is that it's not just the defense attorney's responsibility. If prosecutors and the people have the obligation to care about what their charge is, and the courts actually have also engaged in pulling cases for conferences and reviewing detention status.
So your suggestion was that there be going forward a periodic review of all cases involving young people who are being detained, say, for example, under 18 years of age. So maybe
Yes.
every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks or something.
I wouldn't put a time frame, but it's the concept of constant review of whether or not detention confinement is appropriate and necessary.
Thank you.
Just going to take a look at my notes to make sure I hit all my points. So we turned around our system almost overnight, but justice is still going on in our courts, addressing cases to the extent that we are able to address them.
Thank you, Judge. Meg Reiss. Meg.
So you hear me?
Very well.
Good. Thank you. So thank you, Judge, so much for including me in this conversation, and especially at this time to be able to discuss a system that so disproportionately impacts young people of color, but especially Black young people. So I'm glad that we're all here having this now. I should say, coming behind Liz and Judge Mendelson, it's almost ditto what they said of what happened in our office and how they described the situation. Just to explain that when prior to Raise the Age passing, Eric Gonzalez, the district attorney in Brooklyn, was a big supporter of the passing and committed to fully get behind the spirit of the legislation if it did pass. And that is what has happened in our office. Brooklyn leads the state prior to COVID. Brooklyn leads the state in removal to family court over 92. My latest stats are over 92% of the cases coming of Raise the Age cases, which is 16 and 17, coming into our courthouse are moved to family court. Our response during COVID was very much, as Liz said, arrests were down significantly. And we obviously weren't seeing the volume of cases, but one of the things the district attorney implemented immediately was that any case coming in was prioritized for public health. And so if there was not a public safety risk, we were either declining to prosecute the case or we were deferring prosecution at that time. And exactly as has Judge Mendelson explained, our young adult part didn't skip a minute. So it went immediately from live to virtual, was doing arraignments, removal hearings, assessing services. Our services continued with Brooklyn Justice Initiatives, which is the Center for Court Innovation, and they moved very swiftly from doing live in person to doing virtual. There was some glitches obviously related to technology, people not having devices, people not having Wi-Fi, accessible Wi-Fi that they could access, but ultimately with other partners that they work with, I think Exalt, they helped provide Chromebooks out to those that needed so they could continue with their services. And so I think it's, I mean, really from what has been said already, both from Liz and Judge Mendelson, it sort of has described, it was implemented, that is how our practice went. We did review every young person that was detained at almost immediately. I'd say within a week of us going virtual, we did review, Judge Mendelson, everybody that was detained to see if, in evaluating the public health versus the public safety risk.
Meg, may I just interrupt? Is that an ongoing process that occurs now in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office? This is essentially this review?
So yes, and yes, there is, except that I think there are many of the practices, and I think that's a big part of our conversation tonight, of how we translate many of the practices that we've implemented during this period as being ongoing, the ones that are really beneficial. And the no part of it is, Judge Mendelson is, I'm sorry, Judge Corriero, the no part of it is that the people, we have very few people detained from Brooklyn, and the cases that they're detained on are very, very serious. So it's more as looking when, if somebody is added to detention, it usually is because it's a very, very serious charge that until the case is adjudicated, they wouldn't be released.
The nature of the charge sometimes is pretty much the determining factor in weighing all of the risk and the provability of the case.
I think that in the cases, and I did look at the list of those that were detained, that was one of the responsibilities over the COVID period, is we don't have one person that detained that has just one case either. So they often have multiple cases as well. So it's multiple cases and very, very serious charges.
So while out on bail or out on recognizance, they may have committed another offense, and it makes it extremely difficult to then release them back into the community without some significant assurances, which I understand.
No. And so that really is, so our practice as far as releasing, because we did remove people, that was always our practice. That part of our practice hasn't changed. It's really the intake of cases is what changed, the declination and the deferring of prosecution.
And how would you describe the prosecutor's relationship and view of alternative to incarceration programs?
So, I mean, I think our office has a long history. It's sort of in the DNA of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office to really believe in alternatives, and really, and I think Eric Gonzalez has made it, as you said in the introduction, I mean, it is the principles of the office and the foundation of his Justice 2020 initiative that incarceration is the exception and everything else is the default. And we really work hard every day to try to achieve that. We're not there yet, but that is exactly, that is the North Star for our office, is how do we get to that point where incarceration is the exception? And that's not just for youth, that's for youth and adults. And just to tie in to Liz's point about community-led interventions, and we really are trying to move to that model where community leads, and we support them in the efforts of how they define public safety and how they define wellness for their communities. And we have many initiatives underway to try to achieve that.
Thank you, Meg. Lucy Lang.
Thank you,
Lucy, may I just ask you a quick question, or at least a broader question? What, based on what you've heard, what suggestions would you have that might improve the interaction of the courts with young people and the alternative to incarceration community, if you will?
Judge, I think that one of the #1 things that all offices are learning in this crucially important time for criminal justice reform is an absolute imperative to focus on developing trauma-informed best practices. What we know now about brain development in juveniles, but also about the effects of trauma on everyone's brains, is leaps and bounds beyond what it was even 15 years ago when I first became an assistant district attorney. So to my mind, the hope for the emergence out of COVID-19 is that we can move into a criminal justice system that is not only significantly smaller, but that bears in mind what neuroscience, psychology, and social work now can teach us if we take an interdisciplinary approach to problems. Carry on?
Carry on.
Well, I'm just honored to be here with some of the city's foremost leaders and advocates for city kids, and also, of course, with the audience, who some of whom are far more well versed in this than I perhaps, but all of whom are parents themselves, siblings, and dare I say, some may have even been kids themselves at one point. And I think that it's worth putting this into the kind of national landscape so that folks understand where New York, of course, was quite behind the ball on Raise the Age as compared to the rest of the country. But where we are now is actually meaningfully different from where it was even a few years ago. And I would just remind folks that the country's best funded colleges, universities, prep schools with billion-dollar endowments are struggling with how to keep kids safe at this time. And all of you will know from the evaluations your own children's schools and camps and other things are no doubt making right now, that there are no easy answers about how we're going to keep kids safe. Of course, in the criminal justice system, that is all the more true, especially when we're dealing with children who've been subjected to trauma, who often lack resources, and in a system that has limited resources. And very often we're talking about people being put in co-living environments that are far from ideal. So one point to note is that across the country, the kids who are incarcerated, and this is true in New York, this is not true in New York to this extent, are not a threat to society. 70% of youth who are behind bars in the country are being held on nonviolent offenses. Now, when COVID broke out, more than 30 states had youth advocates come out and say that these facilities were just not equipped to protect youth from the virus, and that the steps recommended for the general public to protect ourselves, social distancing, hand washing, limiting contact, those things were just impossible for youth who are wrapped up in the system, and in particular, youth who are incarcerated in juvenile facilities. So unfortunately, many of you may have read reports, but there were juvenile facilities nationally who were locking children in their rooms for more than 23 hours a day. And of course, that exacerbates, causes secondary, re-traumatizes kids who have already been subjected to really significant traumas that led them to system involvement to begin with. So in several states, Maryland and Texas amongst them, lawyers sought the mass release of juvenile offenders who had underlying health conditions. And while we statewide moved fairly quickly to release nonviolent and older adults from prisons, I think that everyone would agree that it was a bit slower. There was some hesitancy towards extending that benefit to children. And part of it was that we had done a fairly successful job in limiting the numbers in the city. Chicago moved to expedite emergency hearings for youth release. California significantly reduced their intake for juveniles, but the response has been super uneven across the country. And it's very hard to say categorically where we fit into this landscape, except that we're doing far better than anyone would have expected, given how long delayed Raise the Age was. So any number of judges have been taking steps to reduce the number of confined children just over the past month since things have stabilized. Only 10 states have done it at the state level, and only 2 governors, Michigan and Colorado, issued executive orders to begin larger scale release of youth from jails. New York populations have, as other folks have said, have been distinct in some ways from the rest of the country, but it's still an imperfect set of systems that young people are dealing with. And I come at this from the perspective of national prosecution reform, where we have seen prosecutors across the country starting to really limit the use of their resources in lower level cases, and starting to try to pivot some of their work into more pro-social community engagements. And my real hope is that in juvenile cases and in all cases, what we come out of this with is a better understanding of what cases rightly belong in our system that we all work in, and what cases really belong in other systems entirely. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time in justice across the country, and I think that New York has a real potential to be a leader. We have gotten to a place where no one would have thought we could be 5 years ago, and certainly not, Judge. I can't imagine that you could have imagined when you started on the bench that New York would be where we are in terms of our juvenile population. So there's still so much work to be done, but I really commend the folks who've worked so hard on this, to go carefully through every case, to do the careful analysis. And I hope that what we learn from this is something that we take into the future.
So Lucy, are you saying that I was a judge in a different century?
I mean, I didn't say that.
No. You know, I'm being facetious. You know, I'm being facetious. But let me just approach the question this way. I think what you said really, sounds terrific in reason, because I think we all need to look at this, I guess, from the perspective that even young people accused of serious crimes are entitled to be held, if they're going to be held, in safe places. That the society and community has a responsibility to make sure that the secure places where we're keeping young people are safe. And the COVID-19 virus has really complicated that element of society's responsibility to provide a safe and secure environment. I don't mean to cut you off. Is there anything further? Because I just want to leap back a little bit to Liz. You know, putting together this panel, we could have had 8 or 9 other people on the panel who would have had some piece of the pie, some piece of the juvenile justice pie, some stake in it, but we couldn't. We had to limit it in order to make it workable. And so in terms of what the Administration for Children's Services is doing, for example, with respect to young people who may have to be detained because of the severity of the charge or their past records, if you will, what efforts are being made to keep them safe? I think I've muted everybody as a result of that question.
Does this work?
Yeah, yes.
All right.
You can,
So I think that, you know, obviously the safety of kids and of staff in the facilities where the kids are being detained is of primary importance. And I think the city, like the rest of the nation, was learning just for all of us what that meant, how you keep people safe. I think one of the most important things was, you know, reducing the population so that we had enough room to actually ensure that there was social distancing, to ensure that programming happened in such a way that made it as safe as possible, to take advantage of, you know, the crucial pieces that the court system put in place with respect to, you know, remote proceedings. So the entire system shifted. What the court systems did, what the DAs and defenders did, what happened inside the facilities. And I think it's sort of, it also sort of, and to me, this is sort of one of the most important things, it sharpened very much what the stakes are when the decision is made to keep a kid detained. And I think both Judge Mendelson and Meg sort of touched on this, that there was this case-by-case review of every single kid in the system by each DA's office, by corporation counsel, you know, 2 different sets of prosecutors. Obviously, the defenders were crucially important in that, and the judges. And, you know, and the question at issue was, can somebody be kept safe given what their charges are, or and what the alternatives are? So I think that was, you know, a really important moment, and a moment that will continue on. To Judge Mendelson's point, I think, you know, the importance of being able to review on a regular basis is quite critical.
Well, Gamal, you're last but not least, and perhaps from the Alternative to Incarceration program perspective, you can tell us a little bit about how you responded to all of this, and what obstacles, if any, did you encounter in trying to get young people into your program that you thought were suitable for the program?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone to be on such an esteemed panel. This was excellent, and I appreciate that. First of all, I'm sure each and every one of us felt anxious, concerned, stressed, and fear when we first heard the edict. signed by Governor Cuomo as far as us staying home. Those things were very much in our hearts and in our minds. And if we think about it, it was because of our way of life changed overnight. Yes, the way we went to work and how we worked, as well as how we interacted with one another and the social distancing, even how we shopped, that brought trepidation to us. Now imagine if you were 13 to 24. Everything that was stable in your life was taken away overnight. Yes, you couldn't go to school. You couldn't hang out with your friends. You couldn't play sports, do the things that you love. That increased those fears that we ourselves experienced. And one solace that we had is we had stability by staying at home. For some of our young people, they don't have that. In fact, the most unstable place is at home. So how would we be able to rehabilitate? And that's one of the things that we're discussing a lot tonight. And in fact, I found a definition and mentioned the action of restoring someone to health or normal life through training and therapy. So how will we be able to do that? Well, our executive director, Angel Rodriguez here at Avenues for Justice, he always mentions that we need to have that personal touch. How do you have that personal touch? Well, for over 40 years, they have been successful in doing that. In fact, some of our numbers were 96% success rate. We find that those who are with our program no longer are incarcerated after 3 years. So there's success there. How do you do it during a pandemic? Well, we immediately had to pivot and provide things for our young people, such as phones, put minutes on phones of those who had, provide iPads and laptops, and teach them how to utilize that. Well, why? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of their homes are unstable. We wanted to make sure that they knew that Nelson, Carmen, Johnny, Elsie, and Brian would be the stability in their homes. And once they received that technology, well, throughout the night, they would call with their fears to our court advocates. Those are the people who work with them day and night. And we ratcheted it up during the COVID-19. We also then began to address some of their essential needs. Some needed groceries. We provided that. Gift cards so that they could buy various things that they need. We provided that. And in fact, we began to provide essentials such as hand sanitizer, coverings for their face or face masks, and the like. And so this addressed their immediate needs. But then there was other things that needed to be done. How will these young people be able to see their friends? How will they be able to still stay in contact and get training? Well, we began to institute our various workshops via online. We also began to see that they needed mental health issues. So we began to provide counselors, not only for staff, but for our participants, so that they could express their feelings towards professional health. Then we began to do these workshops. Some of the workshops were yoga and meditation, so that way they could relieve their minds. Also, we began to do a workshop with team empowerment. It gave them a platform to discuss the things that they were feeling. And also creative writing and creative thought. They can express themselves. All the while, they still were in contact with our court advocates. And this, we saw, proved to be successful. Now, keep in mind, as was mentioned earlier, the communities that they were coming from were being decimated by this disease. People were dying, and they were seeing that. So that was weighing heavy on them. So once again, we had to ratchet up various things. And finally, we began to see, well, things are starting to become a little normal for the COVID time. And then we saw the lynching of George Floyd. This had a direct impact on our young people. Why? Because they all basically had contact with police officers. Some have even experienced police brutality. To see that really hurt them. So what did we do? Well, we began to address it by, once again, ratcheting up our communication with our young people, having that personal touch, having them tell us how they felt, giving them platforms that they could discuss their feelings. We encouraged them to have their voice, but not to go out because they could be targeted. I'm happy to say at this time none of our young people were arrested during that time period. But yet, they were still able to discuss how they felt. We then began to institute trainings that could provide certificates, like digital literacy, OSHA, and we're continuing to look more and more for various things. We began to partner with corporations, such as First Republic. They are talking to our young people about job readiness, because we know eventually the market will open up, and they need to be job ready, as well as job coaching and mock interviews. These are just some of the things that we've been able to do to help our young people. Now, yes.
So I was just going to say, how did you have to change from what you ordinarily do in terms of developing this connection that's so important for the young people that we give to you need in order to turn their lives around? What did you have to do different? And in the sense that what will you do differently from here on in that you've learned from the issues caused by the COVID virus?
That's an excellent question. We normally have two centers, one in Harlem and one in the Lower East Side, that we used to invite our young people to get their workshops and training and have that one-on-one counseling. Well, now we've learned due to this that we can do it virtual style by means of Zoom. So now we can talk to people and young people rather, from Staten Island to Far Rockaway. We can connect with them via this service, as well as continually use the phone to talk to them, educate them, mentor them. And so that really helped us to appreciate that we don't have to be just in one borough, but we can affect the lives of many throughout. And that's one of the things that we appreciated. And we can have others involved. As was mentioned, we've been working with corporates who have been in turn mentoring. So these are all ways that we enjoy and we are able to affect these young people during this time. And I just want to mention that if anybody wanted to look at our website, that is an excellent place to look, see if you might want to donate either time or money in regards to this. But we all can have a platform in the way that we can affect young people with insight, encouragement, and hope. And that's what we at Avenues for Justice do with our young people.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gamal. I know that Liz, you have a deadline that you're going to need to meet. So the next phase of the panel was to have each panelist ask a question of another panelist from the perspective of trying to cross-pollinate, if you will, the different agencies, and maybe something will come out of it that we weren't expecting. So I was going to say, Liz, if you have a question that you'd like to ask another panelist, ask it, and then we'll have, I think it was Judge Mendelson wanted to ask you a question, so we will have you get your time in without having to leave prematurely. I can hear you, Liz. You're muted.
I'm going to be so good at this by the
yes,
end.
I hope.
Right now, I'm failing miserably.
As long as you heard me, that's okay.
I mean,
so, did you want to ask a question of another panelist?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually, I do think we're at this moment that out of these really terrible events that have befallen us and that we are living through right now, that in fact there's an opportunity to fundamentally shift how we think about security and safety and what the role of the criminal justice system is in it. And I think each person on this panel has sort of touched on that in one way or another. And I would be really interested in what do you think the concrete things are? Each person has sort of a different part of the system that they see or work in. What are the concrete things that we should do in order to further shrink the footprint of the justice system in the lives of young people?
And did you have someone in mind that you thought you'd like to put that question to? I do.
I think it's a question anyone could answer, so I would.
We could have a number of answers, but can I kind of point to Lucy, because I thought maybe this is something that falls within your think tank.
You were going to answer that question. I think you have a number of things. That you
Okay.
No.
We'll give everybody a chance to answer that question, because I think it's such an important question. It goes really to the heart of what we're trying to do tonight. So we'll start with Lucy. Did you have some concrete suggestions?
Thanks for the question, Liz. I feel most optimistic right now about the promise of restorative justice, and I hope that when Meg when it's Meg's turn, she can share a bit about common justice and the amazing, really innovative work that Brooklyn is doing around restorative practices for young people. I think that we're seeing increasing data on how impactful restorative circles and processes that really prioritize reconciliation and restoration amongst parties can have a far better long-term effect, both on young people and on their communities. So my hope is that we will learn from some international models and start to incorporate more of that into our responses to cases involving young people. And I think Brooklyn has been a real leader in some of those cases.
Lucy, when you say restorative justice programs, are they actually functioning as alternative to incarceration programs as well?
The term has a vast array of meaning, but often in the current context, we're talking about using it as an alternative to incarceration, or even in some cases as part of a sentence reduction strategy where there may even be a punitive element, although ideally not for children. It also can include, it could even include pre-charging type outcomes instead, but I think it could run the gamut of areas in which it could be implemented in the system. And Meg can talk a bit more about the successes that they've had. I think that we should be looking at ways it could be incorporated from the very beginning of criminal cases, though, and enabling folks to avoid convictions wherever possible, try to restore victims and make them whole, and try to address community harms writ large.
Meg, your office has relied on restorative justice programs during the course of a regular proceeding, prosecution?
Yes. So the program Lucy's referring to is called Common Justice, Daniel Shire's program. And so Common Justice is for 18 to 26-year-olds who are facing a year or more in prison. So it is not for anybody who's facing jail time, a year or more in prison. And there are some exceptions to what charges they'll take. They don't take domestic violence cases. They don't take sexual assault cases. They prefer to have cases that have a complainant. But they do take sometimes they'll take a gun case in unusual circumstances, and they don't take cases where people are suffering from mental illness for obvious reasons, because there are other resources that are more applicable. But it's an incredible program. I don't even want to call it a program.
Right.
So
the program works with the more serious offenses.
Yes.
And essentially what the prosecution does is essentially defer further prosecution while they're in the program. And if they successfully complete the program, then to come up with a disposition that insulates them from a criminal record, essentially.
Yeah, so the way that it works in our office is that, again, where we go with the default. So the district attorney has made anybody who fits that criteria of 18 to 26, facing a year or more in prison, and their charges fall within the charges that are acceptable to common justice, the case has to go through, there's a small group of us that do the screening of the cases. They must be submitted to this group for screening to go to common justice, regardless of whether or not whoever the line assistant or the boss in what we're broken down into zones thinks the case is appropriate for alternatives. And then once a determination is made in our committee, it goes to common justice, and they do outreach to the person that's been harmed. This is their language. And they have that conversation. What's amazing about common justice is they commit, whether that person who's been harmed wants to participate or not, they commit to them that they have services for life. So has I think several people, Lucy had mentioned, and maybe Gamal had mentioned about addressing underlying trauma. So even if they don't want to go through the restorative justice process, and the case moves back to being a traditional prosecution, they still are able to address their underlying trauma so that hopefully that can be addressed and not create problems in the future. And so,
yeah, I was just going to jump back to Lucy for a moment, because there are 5 separate district attorney's offices within New York City, and each is autonomous and each has their own policies, point of view, perspective, if you will. Is there a way to bring all 5 into the family of restorative justice and embrace it, if you will, as had the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office? Is that something that you're working on, or is there anything? How would that be accomplished? Because of course every district attorney is autonomous, and but nevertheless, it's this perspective that's so important, that these kinds of alternatives will reduce the numbers and give people an opportunity to be restored in the community, and give the victims, if you will, some sense of solace to go forward.
Well, Judge, I nominate you to get all 5 DAs in a room.
The next panel.
Restorative process. But yes, we certainly are doing our best to bring together restorative practices in all of the borough's DA's offices. The Bronx Alternatives to Incarceration Unit is increasingly increasing their reliance on those kinds of practices. Manhattan, in fact, used it on a homicide case for the first time, from what I can tell, in New York City history, just this past December, and is, I believe, embarking on it on some very low-level cases. I do think that the leadership from the bench on this can be really tremendous, that there's huge opportunity, and certainly some measure of the ways in which I've seen even Judge Mendelson conduct matters in the courtroom are evocative of a restorative type practice in which people come together and it's a more collaborative undertaking. And I've heard several judges recently say that they feel that doing Zoom hearings is more collaborative than being in the courtroom because of the nature of everyone being sort of equally sized. So I think that there are some elements of almost procedural justice that can be baked into these restorative practices. And I think that leadership from the bench could be huge, but I am certainly hoping that all of the city's DAs will increasingly start to embrace it, especially with respect to young people.
Thank you. Judge Mendelson, I wanted to give you I know you had a question also for Liz, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask her that question. But before you do that, do you think it would be beneficial if there was an effort to look at court rules, which essentially provide standards and outlines for the individual judges, that in some way would incorporate this idea of using alternatives to incarceration as an integral part of a disposition, and thereby giving the judges the backing, if you will, of the court system in terms of making these efforts?
So I always hesitate when I think in terms of court rules with my trial bench judge, independent right to an ability and oath taking to utilize the type of justice that is my charge to do in my courtroom. So I hesitate to think about rules. But I do think that judges recognize, quite frankly, in all sorts of cases, and this applies to cases in the youth part as well as our entire criminal justice system, the overwhelming majority of cases are not addressed by way of a full jury trial. So we are using alternative dispute resolution in our criminal justice system in various ways. The concept of utilizing alternatives to incarceration is part of the fabric of what is done in a courtroom. You know, Judge Corriero, you began that for us in the state of New York in your youth part that you created before Raise the Age mandated us to have youth parts. And I do believe that for the adult justice system, even in our state, with criminal justice reform, we are thinking automatically of the concept of utilizing alternatives to incarceration and to detention as part of the fabric of what we do. And quite frankly, in New York City's youth parts, that's what's happening. And it may look different in each of the 5 counties for the reasons that you talked about with the autonomy of the district attorneys, but there are alternative to incarceration programs in all 4 of the larger counties, and now we know Avenues for Justice, who we've been trying to get to Staten Island for a very long time now. They know that they can be there. All of our counties have alternative to incarceration programs. It's about making them rich, supporting them, and quite frankly, figuring out ways that they can best address the tougher cases, the cases where young people, while they are out, are accused of reoffending, cases where there is instability. It's the more difficult cases. And I was going to suggest restorative justice as a brand new idea, because I don't think we use it as much in the criminal justice arena in New York State and New York City as we could. And I also suggest if we're going to be looking at the cases, we go for the tougher cases, the more difficult cases, the more serious cases. Communities need to be healed whenever there is harm. And so I'm not trying to say a misdemeanor isn't important to that person who's been victimized. However, the much more difficult cases, the cases that we're talking about where young people are confined, are cases where there is serious harm. So that's where we really need to, I think, dedicate and concentrate our restorative justice practices and have them be effective, not just for healing those who have been victimized, but prevention, which we don't use. We don't use the word prevention in the criminal justice world as much as we do in the child welfare world that I come from and work in deeply still. And figuring out ways to prevent in the criminal justice system without widening the net and increasing the opportunities for arrest, but putting in place interventions that can have an impact that prevents future involvement and arrest is something that I'm looking forward to.
I know that Nancy wants to weigh in on some of these things. I just know that, but I'm going to have to ask you to wait a minute, because I want to make sure that Liz has the opportunity to answer Judge Mendelson's question before she has to leave. I know.
My question was, how do we sustain this? When there were arrests at the height of the pandemic for only very, very serious offenses, we only arrested young people for only very, very serious offenses. So we figured out how to do it at the height of the pandemic. How do we sustain that when, God willing, we get to the other side of this, was my question. You're muted.
I've utterly failed, but no. I think that is the question. That is absolutely the question. Is there a way to kind of freeze in time? Obviously, you know, we are living under very different circumstances, but there is something hopeful about using the criminal justice system in absolutely the most parsimonious way, arresting only when it is absolutely the last resort, putting people in when it's absolutely the last resort. And I think, you know, I mean, if you read the papers, obviously, as we all do, maybe not the paper, whatever it is, if you get the news, you know, obviously there are, as always, very different views as to, you know, what's happened with crime or, you know, during the pandemic. And I think the crucial thing is for the decision makers in the justice system to sit and understand really in a very clear-eyed way what happened during this period, who actually got arrested, who actually went in, what actually happened to crime, and then what are, to your extremely important point, what are what we call the alternatives, but actually maybe should be the main system, and how do we ensure that you don't, that we stop behavior before it even starts by investing in other things that are not the criminal justice system, so that people never get to the criminal justice system. You know, in the criminal justice system, that's when suddenly now, you know, that's where often people who are arrested access services. But why then? Why not earlier? And I actually think that despite the really serious economic situation that we're in right now, the opportunity to explore prevention, do prevention in a way that actually works, will be both economically beneficial as well as a better way just simply to ensure that we work so together.
Liz, I think when we last talked, we were talking in general about some kind of diversionary action within the precincts themselves, the police precincts themselves, as well as, of course, preventing people from getting arrested at all. Is there something in the works now, any program or policy that will kind of channel a lot of young people out of the system at the precinct level?
So I think Meg is working hard on this. I just wanted to say one thing before we get to that. And I really want to harp on how we stop people from entering the criminal justice system at all. And so here's sort of a concrete example. We now have an extremely robust network of community-based organizations that's called the Crisis Management System, and they are people who come from the neighborhood, have often been involved in the criminal justice system themselves, and know when disputes may be escalating to a point of violence. And they intervene in those disputes and mediate the disputes. And associated with that are also all kinds of services that they're able to offer their clients, such as jobs programs and other things. We've had a number of different studies of this approach to violence, to stop it before somebody gets shot instead of arresting people afterwards. And what we have seen now in two separate studies is that in neighborhoods that have this very localized, community-oriented, neighborhood-run effort, shootings reduced by 30% more than in comparable neighborhoods. And that's just one example. There are so many others and so many other ways that I think we need to think about it even before somebody gets to the criminal justice system. But Meg, you're working on something exciting. So.
Meg, do you want to say? I know Nancy is still there, and I know that you're ready to go. But give me a moment.
I would just, so yes, we absolutely, Judge, we absolutely have something that we had hoped to get off the ground before COVID happened, where we were, and now with our ability to actually screen and draft complaints post-arrest remotely, it makes it even more possible. Both it has now a public health benefit, a public safety benefit, and a community trust benefit, which obviously rolls up into public safety. But the idea is with really a hub community partner for us to screen arrests at the precinct. And we were doing this on misdemeanors, and we were trying to take advantage of bail reform, and that the majority of misdemeanors would be DATs. And our community partner would respond to the precinct and connect with the person there. And then really sharing power with the community. And this is to Liz's point, she mentioned the CMS sites, the Cure Violence sites, of having that positive social network in the community that's really at the grassroots level, which really is what interrupts and puts somebody on a positive trajectory. And so we would have that community partner connect with the precinct, try to work with that person, identifying if there's an underlying issue or if it's just a need for an opportunity, and really giving sort of that life skills, for lack of a better word, really, and then reporting back to us that they feel they've completed what was necessary, and then we would dismiss the case. So we were really leaving in the hands of our community partner what the proper outcome was, and that it's been satisfied.
Is there funding made available to the community partner or this particular program?
We were actively trying to fundraise together for this effort, and
So it's not coming out. It's not coming out of the DA's budget at this point.
so we don't have budget for that, but we were actually trying. So we don't have budget to be able to shift it in that way. But the DA himself actively tried to fundraise from foundations for the community partner. No money for us, but actively for our community partner, tried to fundraise for money so that they could support this effort. And so we're hoping, and this is sort of one of the things, sort of not flipping it back to Liz, but just to say, do you believe, Liz, that the police department will really broaden their approach to what can be diverted from the precinct? Right now, we just divert low-level narcotics cases, but really broaden that and be able to do it all from the precinct. And to Judge Mendelson's point of that really is true prevention, because we know, and Liz cited her research, but there's so much research about really the most effective is connecting people to a positive social network. And so this would be it, and that would be the ultimate in prevention.
Nancy?
Gamal really wants to talk, so I'm going to let Gamal talk, and then I'll go.
Okay, Gamal.
I was just going to say that we've actually been doing that prevention piece. We had those who are at risk within our communities come, and they actually take part in the various workshops that we're dealing with, as well as what was mentioned as far as job training and the like. And this has been very successful for us. So I think this is an excellent means prevention, and that's something that we at Avenues for Justice are on the cutting edge of.
Yeah, and of course, one of the major obstacles to all of these wonderful ideas, important ideas, and things that need to be done in order to recognize the developmental differences of children and treat them appropriately is funding. Funding. For example, when I talked about the integration of the alternative to incarceration programs in the process, most of the ATIs have to go out on their own to get funding. And one of the things that we tried to do in the youth part was to make the case for institutionalization of the utilization of alternatives to incarceration, and thereby require some governmental backing and funding for this disposition. Just as the government and the state government funds correctional institutions, the state government should invest perhaps in alternative to incarceration programs, restorative justice programs, etc., to the extent that these great ideas are supported. Otherwise, you have to go to 5, 6 different funders yearly to keep afloat, if you will. But Nancy, did you want to respond to anything?
So I think some of what everyone is talking about is a complete reimagining of the system, and part of what this pandemic has provided for us is a platform to see that you can completely change things and the sky does not fall. And I think that we have been seeing that through implementation of Raise the Age, as the system has drastically changed, and we have watched as crime has continued to drop and arrests have continued to drop. And I think the conversation about prevention and alternatives is a conversation that has been going on for many years. But I think the reality in New York City, and this is the reality in many large cities in the country, is that almost all of the court-involved youth come from incredibly underserved neighborhoods. And if there was attention paid to those neighborhoods at their core, meaning not through the criminal justice system, if the mental health system was supported in those communities, if the schools were improved in those communities, if there were after-school programs for those youth, if there were safe pathways of travel for those young people to and from school, then school attendance would increase. If there was more affordable and accessible daycare so that parents, low-income parents, could afford to work and did not have to use their older children to provide daycare for their younger children and depriving those older children of availability for services, then, and I think only then, are we really going to get to problem solving for this issue. Because what we are really talking about is creating safe environments for poor children. And in this city, the reality is it's poor children of color. And either we're going to own that and say we're going to address that in their communities, for their communities, by their communities, or we're just going to continue to wait until things go awry and then we'll respond in the criminal justice system. And so I think there will always be kids who misbehave, and how we respond to that behavior is a never-ending question. And some of that misbehavior is quite serious, and the harm is quite serious, and the response has to change as that harm escalates. However, if most of the court-involved kids and their families had appropriate supports from birth, they would not be court-involved. And that is just the reality. So I do think, in the same way that the courts now during COVID are looking at kids saying you don't really need to be incarcerated because you violated some court order, there really needs to be a complete reassessment, in my view, of the system. Like, we don't need mandatory minimums for children. We don't need incarceration to be the only way to keep children out, safe in their community if they can't be at home. There could be residential alternatives for those kids. We could expand supportive housing for young people. We could expand therapeutic foster care for court-involved kids. There's a very large percentage of crossover kids who are both in foster care or have histories of being in foster care, who come into the criminal court system. And the adult court system is not set up in any way to address those kids' needs. So if we're reimagining, I would vote go big.
Okay, so Nancy, when is your next appearance before the city council? Good, Gamal, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask a question of any one of the other panelists.
Yes, I was going to ask Judge Mendelson, are the courts considering any special policies to address the lag between the time that a young person is arrested to when they are arraigned, to minimize the young person as far as their vulnerability to the COVID or any other disease that might come about?
Thanks for that question. I feel like we needed a moment of pause and reflection after Nancy's sermon. And before I answer your question, I have to just say, Nancy, that was so well said. I could not agree with you more.
Right.
It requires going big. It requires revolutionary action, quite frankly, in terms of how our systems arrive in all of those various systems, the schools, et cetera. So I was deeply touched by your way of presenting that, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. The courts actually do have a prioritization system for young people who have been arrested, particularly in post this COVID reduced court operations and virtual court operations. We separate the young people. First of all, the concept of sight and sound segregation has continued throughout this process, even when we were having heightened arrests resulting from the protests and the thefts that were happening connected or not connected to the protests. We still had a separate system for young people who were arrested. So they were always considered essential and in immediate need of attention. We set up separate exclusive video feeds for young people who are appearing before our virtual courts in the criminal court as well as the family court. And so they didn't have to wait in line in the adult queue, which quite frankly takes longer. There is a separate line always for the young people. And during that period when we did have a high number of arrests, we added new courtrooms and went back to from the first time in many, many years, there was a lobster shift to try to address the backlog in arraignment. So we do have a process to prioritize and expedite the cases and separate the cases of the young people who are arrested.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Who hasn't had a chance to ask a question? Lucy, did you had a question?
Well, I was hoping that Gamal could take it really granular and maybe give an example of how the system has succeeded in an individual case during COVID and maybe a case in which it has really failed.
Well, I can give you two cases that were pretty positive, actually, but they were two different environments. What I mean by that is that we had one young person who was in a family of 8. And at first, things were not well. We had to provide technology for them so that way they could keep in contact with us. We had to get meals and groceries for the family. And then our court advocate took a special interest in that young person, constantly calling them. They were calling them at 1 o'clock in the morning, talking to them about their feelings and how things were going. In turn, we eventually were able to get her to be able to be on our workshops. And in time, they began to critique our workshops, which was very beneficial for us so that we knew exactly what the young people needed during that time. So that was a positive. Whereas we had another young man before COVID struck. They were failing out of school. They were despondent to their parent. Things were looking very bad, very bleak. In fact, we had to get them into a residential drug program. And I actually took them there, and they were trying to figure out various ways of how they could get out of it. But we eventually got them there. They too were constantly calling their court advocates at 2, 3 in the morning, wanting to get out. But eventually, they settled in. They just recently got their report card. They passed all their subjects. Now they're talking about they want to be a firefighter or go into the Army. So just in 4 months' time, they have changed. Why? And I think that the purpose of both of them was the contact by the court advocate. So really, that personal touch really does help.
Nancy, have you asked a question? And Meg, you need to ask a question.
I have a question for Nancy. First of all, thank you for what you said earlier. If you had in sort of what would be number 1 on your wish list that you would want to change within the existing practice for youth in the criminal justice system, what would be the one thing that you would want to change? What's at the top of your list?
I would like to see the opportunity for kids who complete a program or complete a path of rehabilitation to have the possibility of dismissal. I think that we hold too much over these kids' heads for too long. A year or 2 years for a 14, 15, 16-year-old is a very long time. And sometimes the extended time period of oversight becomes a trap for them and prevents them from doing things, pursuing paths that they want to pursue. We've had kids who couldn't go to certain programs because they were still on probation. And so I would like to see an opportunity, a path for kids to get out from under the system if they have demonstrated rehabilitation.
And that's a very interesting proposal, Nancy. And I remember when I was an assistant district attorney in New York County with Frank Hogan, 69 through 73. Wow.
Another century?
Yes, 1969 through 1973. Within the district attorney's office, and this also I think is directed to me, within the district attorney's office, there was something called the Youth Counsel Bureau. We referred to it as DA's YCB. And we had authority in appropriate cases to refer a young person's case to the Youth Counsel Bureau, which was operating within the district attorney's office, actually had an office within the DA's office. And the Youth Counsel Bureau would refer them to an appropriate alternative to incarceration program that could deal with the issues that brought them to the court in the first instance. And if they cooperated and did what they were supposed to do, we, the DAs, were authorized to go in and dismiss the case. And I think, so I think what you're suggesting is not something that's so impossible to achieve, but I also think it kind of lends perhaps some weight to what you're trying to do in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, because in a way, if you're giving kids to restorative justice, you have a responsibility to oversee essentially that referral. Perhaps there's a way to more formally institutionalize that kind of disposition within the structure of the office.
And we do, Judge, have for our gun diversion, which is also for youth for 18 to 25, they do get a dismissal at the end. And for our, we have a felony diversion part now that just started up this year, and that is also with the promise of dismissal at the end. So I think it's something that is definitely an opportunity for us to explore. It's not foreign to our practice.
Has anyone not had an opportunity to ask a question?
I'd like to ask Gamal a question.
Go ahead.
Given that you're in the communities, if you could identify one or two of the most important needs that you see not being met for the kids and families in the communities that you would like to see met to provide additional support for them.
One of the things definitely is definitely a job support. And we are truly trying to help our young people because at this time, summer youth is no longer this year. And once the COVID opens up and people are looking for jobs, our young people need to be ready to go, so to speak, to make some ends meet. So we ask that more and more could help us as far as equipping our young people, not only just to do a resume and the like, but also giving them some skills and opportunities, perhaps to intern or the like. So those are one of the things that we look at. And as you mentioned earlier with your fiery speech, the systemic chain within our system needs to be broken. So there's a lot of other things such as housing and the way housing is being handled. That too can be one that could be looked at. But for now, I would say employment is one of the major things at this time.
Well, thank you, thank you. I think we've answered an awful lot of the questions that were previously submitted to us, but I think there are one or two questions that I think we have time to ask that came in from the audience. So if you just bear with me for a moment, I guess I'm going to direct this to Gamal, but anybody else can respond if they like. Gamal, what are the biggest hurdles to expansion for programs like Avenues for Justice and others? Is it just funding, or are there other major roadblocks that prevent a program like Avenues for Justice from scaling up?
That's an excellent question. Partly, yes, funding. We definitely would need funding. If you think about it, to warehouse a young person in the criminal justice system is close to over $300,000, whereas for our program to get the services that a young person gets for the whole entire year is about $5,000. So that is relatively a small number if you think about it. So funding is definitely one of the things, as well as for the courts to utilize different alternative to incarceration programs as well. There are quite a few, and we all do various things quite well, but the utilization more of the alternative incarceration, I think, is a hurdle that I think as time goes on, as we continue to reimagine, we can utilize them much more. And so I think
now, just to dig a little deeper on that, have you had experiences where you've asked the court to give you a kid that you thought you could work with and it was denied? How would you have?
That's our daily activity.
And you were denied, but thought that what was the stated reason the court denied it, and do you think you could have addressed it in some fashion?
Well, perhaps there was the crime might have felt it was too great for a program like ours to undertake. But we've had many serious crimes that young people have been through our programs and have never went back into the criminal justice system. Just give us a chance. So some feel that way. Other times, perhaps the attorney might feel, well, if I lock them into this program, perhaps I could get a better deal later. So it's really navigating between both the attorneys as well as with the judge, as far as helping them see that we can truly help this young person, no matter what that crime might be.
Well, we have about 15 or so minutes left, so I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to briefly sum up or state anything you'd like to say that you think is relevant for the audience to understand about this issue and what you think the future should be. So we can start with Judge Mendelson.
Always make the judge go first.
Yeah, I've learned that.
So I really don't have anything to add to what I've said. This has been a really rich discussion. To Gamal's point about the judges and being more willing to accept alternatives in risky cases, I will tell you that, risk is the stakes are high. And, I've been in that seat. I'm now a policy leader and doing different types of judging. But, when you are taking a risk and you're talking about an arrest that involves some harm that's very, very serious, I understand, and I felt it for the judge that you're maybe referring to, who might think that this is not the young person for that type of intervention at that time. One of the things that we did do, and I would recommend often, is arranging with the ability of all of the youth court judges who see young people in their courts to have the opportunity to hear from the various programs, all the programs. Avenues for Justice has been involved in that. Nancy, you've been to a million of them with a million different youth court judges, but I think it's a rich opportunity and something that's important to have all of the various alternative to incarceration providers with, the defense bar will be in the room, the prosecutors will be in the room, and the judges in the room, just to hear what each has to offer as a reminder to the judges of the availability and the particular skill sets.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think periodically we used to do that in the youth part, but you hit upon the thing that I think is so, when I originally said that how to deal with an adolescent was a complex problem, and now it's made even more complex. What I was really also kind of reaching for was this idea of risk management. And I remember, because the judges in the youth part are making decisions about letting young people out or keeping them in or where to put them. And the judges bear the burden of a mistake in this arena. And I think sharing with judges that I've always thought that paying attention is the greatest alternative to detention. And paying attention to the kids that you place in these programs, using the programs to share the risk with you by requiring them to report to you regularly, to be responsible, is one way of kind of reducing the weight of that decision on the part of a judge. And that's something that we all had to face as judges, making that decision in that kind of case where you weren't certain. And that's why it's so important that programs like Avenues for Justice and restorative justice programs recognize that when a judge gives you a young person, you have a responsibility to that judge. You have to be responsive, and you have to be responsible, and you have to be willing to report regularly to make that judge feel secure in his decision to give a young person who's accused. And in the youth part, it was always kids who were accused of felonies and acting in concert in robberies and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, Lucy, did you want to sum up?
When you first suggested that we might, in the course of this conversation, come to a kind of consensus position, I have to admit that I was a little bit skeptical, but I do think that Nancy really effectively did do that. It is, however, a question of will towards creating something that's sustainable. And I think that to Judge Mendelson's point, that is going to require a certain amount of tolerance from the public or some measure of risk. We are going to have to be thoughtful about how these reforms get implemented and looked to root causes. And then there's a question that was raised in the Q&A on the side that I wanted to just float, which was, do you find it problematic that the legitimacy of your enforcement apparatus, the NYPD, is perhaps compromised, seeing as they've been for years exposed as using racial profiling, so perhaps any of these arrests of young people is illegitimate and needs to be called into question. And I think that the issue of race, as several of my colleagues have raised, is absolutely core to this. And part of what I feel inspired by is that we seem to be in a moment of racial reckoning as a country, and we have to start with children on taking that on. So to the person who asked that question, I certainly don't have an answer, but I hear the concerns about legitimacy of enforcement, and I think that we are all deeply aware of how troubled that history is in our city and nationally. And I think that we are, to part of Nancy's point, we have to be very intentionally anti-racist in undertaking policies that tackle the core issues that are at stake.
Thank you. Meg?
I just hope that we really prioritize the things that have come out. As Liz said, there's going to be work done to study how we were able to cut down on arrests so drastically. I think one of the best things that's come out of this and is the virtual court parts, especially for young people. I know Brooklyn also has a young adult court, which is misdemeanors for 18 to 24, but also the young adult part. Both of them, it's funny having to have people come to court in the daytime and miss school, when a virtual part where hopefully you can achieve, and they did achieve for the young adult part, all of the same things that they were doing live. And a lot of young people feel much safer not having to be, at least in downtown Brooklyn, and coming to a courthouse where it's a much more unpredictable setting. And I saw in one of the questions was how are we going to keep people safe because of everybody who is in a courtroom and what that will look like. And this is a possible way to some of these practices to continue and say, well, this was successful for this group, and maybe it's good to be in person to the point of being very intentional about monitoring what's happening, especially if you're going to take more chances. But being in person is important, but maybe not every appearance. So I hope those are one thing. And then, of course, just to keep banging the drum about actually preventing cases from ever coming into the courthouse in the first place. That should be our big priority. From going to the very big that Nancy said and making that the priority to things that we can do right now by diverting right from the precinct. That could happen now, and people would never have to come to the courthouse, connected to resources in their own community, and supported by that community long after the case is resolved or dismissed.
Thank you. Gamal.
Well, we were asked to reimagine tonight about rehabilitation, and we discussed this quite a bit with excellent ideas. But hopefully this won't be just talk. Hopefully we can come away with something and reimagine exactly what we need to do. Rehabilitate not only for the minor crimes, but those who have committed even major crimes. How can they be rehabilitated? These are the things, hopefully, that will turn not from just talk, but into action. And appreciated talking with everyone this evening.
Nancy.
I would like to second the call for restorative. I think that the reality is that much of the harm that's caused is caused in our kids' neighborhoods. And the courts often do not ask what effect that has happened on the neighborhoods. We very rarely invite the neighborhoods into court. And we very rarely hear the voices of the affected neighborhoods and the communities. And even for those kids who are detained or incarcerated for some period of time, they are returning to those communities, and how those communities welcome them back, how they support those kids, what services the kids get while they're in, how we treat those kids and their families with dignity and support, I think is all part of this reimagining. And restorative is just an umbrella, really, for that conversation. So I am glad that it was raised on this panel, and I am hopeful that that cry for that becomes louder and stronger as we go forward.
Well, first of all, let me just say that how grateful I am and honored I am to be amongst you. I thought that perhaps my appearance would somehow evaporate into the cloud. I guess that's the terminology, but it didn't. You grounded me. I'm so impressed with what I've heard. And if I could just bring it to a conclusion, if you will, I would just say, when I quoted Martin Luther King, in that one line, that one statement about bending the arc so that we get closer to the destination of justice, I think when he uttered this statement, that was in maybe 30 years ago, or maybe even longer than that. And today, I think we, for the first time, and we seem to have the opportunity now to reimagine policing, reimagine judging, reimagining how we're going to deal with the alternative to incarceration programs that have been so important to many of us and to many of the young people who have been able to come out of the system without a record, with the benefit of job skills, with the benefit of marketable talents that can be used to be constructive members of society. And I can't really add much to what Nancy said, but I think that the deeper questions that she raised have to be addressed. and cannot be ignored any longer. The idea of a quality education for every young offender's education is so crucial to getting out of the revolving door of staying in trouble. To me, education is the key to the American dream, as best as I can say it. But I just want to conclude with a quote that has always been dear to my heart as a judge. And it came from late Justice William Brennan of the Supreme Court, who is sometimes referred to as the conscience of the court. And I've tried to use it as my guiding principle in working with the young people who came before me. And he said that if due process values are to be preserved in the bureaucratic state of the late 20th century, it may be essential that officials possess passion, the passion that puts them in touch with the dreams and disappointments of those with whom they deal, the passion that understands the pulse of life beneath the official version of events. So if I had one wish for all of our public officials, that they seize this moment with the passion that Justice Brennan talked about, so that we can reimagine what justice should look like in the near future. And I think that each of you has played a significant role in giving us an idea of how that is going to look. And you have my gratitude. Thank you all very much. And thank all of you in the audience who've waited this long for me to conclude tonight's panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
See you all again soon.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.